time when basic truths are in dispute and under attack, but I'm glad that I can objectively say that the class of 2015 is the best Nieman year. But that aside, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce as our guest right now, Joe Kahn, somebody who does know what it means to search for the truth. And he is the executive editor of the New York Times and was appointed in April of 2022 after an already illustrious career that stretches back to this very university, where as an undergraduate he was president of the Harvard Crimson. And actually, if you go to the Crimson offices, you can see a caricature of Joe hung up on the wall. So make a migration there at some point. Then he actually started getting paid to do journalism at the Dallas Morning News, and then went from there to the Wall Street Journal, and finally the New York Times, where he's been since 1998. He and his colleague, Jim Yardley, won the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for their stories on China's justice system. The prize was in 2006. And then at the New York Times, he became managing editor in 2016 and took up the post of executive editor in June of last year. So welcome, Joe Kahn. Thank you. So Joe, you've been on the job for 16 months now, enough time to begin start implementing your vision for the paper. I do want to actually have you put on your writer's hat for a second and take a little trip with me into the future and imagine this story that begins like this. After a successful tenure as executive editor of the New York Times, Joe Kahn announced today that he is stepping down from the role. Second paragraph. Under his leadership, the New York Times blank. Can you complete that paragraph for me?
Yeah, kind of writing your own obituary.
Retirement story.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, I actually, at one point, probably that word or that verb probably would have been survived, right? I mean, we've all been through at our news organizations moments where the very kind of survival of the kind of journalism that we're doing was in question, and if you were the leader or the editor that helped kind of get you through that period of existential threat, that probably would have been part of that line. We're not in that period now. So actually you have both sort of the opportunity, but also the higher challenge of figuring out the New York Times is going to be around long after I'm gone. It's pretty clear. We've got, you know, a kind of good subscriber base, and that tends to be sticky, and people stick around. You wouldn't know it some days from my inbox, especially the last couple of weeks, but they actually do stick around. And so survival is not the issue. The issue is, for me, really what we're doing today to figure out how to translate the kind of journalism that the New York Times has done for almost 2 centuries into something that's meaningful in as much of an everyday sense as possible for a different demographic, for a younger audience that frankly isn't going to spend as much time reading, honestly. They may read as part of, you know, multi-format or multimedia, but the traditional form where we really invest in making our journalism valued to people, that kind of deeper or long-form journalism, is just going to have to be updated to reach a different generation. And I think, you know, if there's something that I can accomplish in my relatively few years as editor to help position ourselves to be interesting and attractive and urgent to a different generation, I think that would be something I'd be proud of.
One of the things I know that you've identified as a priority and that would serve that very goal is to have a more diverse staff. So I'm going to be a little cheeky here and ask whether you want to hire, well, you yourself are a straight, white, cisgender male who grew up in Boston and went to Harvard. Do you basically want to hire people who are the antithesis of you?
What's the antithesis? Yeah, I mean, there are largely overall, there are enough people like me who are in journalism, and we're not looking to diversify the staff by recruiting a lot more of exactly what you described. That is true. And the future of a newsroom that's going to appeal to a much larger national and international audience has to look for opportunities to hire really top, talented journalists, but from a much wider spectrum than we look for traditionally. And obviously we're talking about race and gender. We're also really talking about, and probably the biggest diversity challenge that we have is geography, right? Is people from across the world, across the country, who may not necessarily have had the opportunities to get trained in journalistic practices where they live or where they grow up, and we need to invest in recruiting, training, developing journalists to represent a much wider spectrum of cultural, social, religious background, geographic background. To sort of put in the American context a kind of a fine point on it, we need people who are racially diverse, gender diversity, but we need some of them to be from red states. We need a staff that represents the country that we're trying to understand and cover, and a lot of that is going to be cultural and religious diversity. So even as we continue to invest in the traditional way of diversifying race and gender, we actually have achieved, a kind of gender parity, or actually, New York Times newsroom is about 53% women. So we're not, we don't need to accelerate gender. We still have a long way to go on race, but we have an especially long way to go, I would say, on geography and diversifying the cultural experience of people who are part of the newsroom.
Briefly, what are you doing to actually try to expand that pipeline from those very areas?
It's really hard because the local news media ecosystem, as you know well, is collapsing or has collapsed in many places. So my predecessor as New York Times editor now has Dean McKay has a program underway to find locally situated journalists who want the support to be able to do locally relevant, largely investigative journalism work. And the condition of joining that program, which we're funding and which we hope to continue to expand, is that the journalist wants to stay in that place. It doesn't mean that at some point they may not raise their hand for a job, in a big city somewhere else, but they want to be committed to that community. And we're hoping to be able to help fund them and help support and get them editing, multimedia support, whatever, so that they can be a journalist in those locations. And that's one small step, but it's among the different things that we're doing.
Because you put it as boldly as saying from the red states, of course, after the 2016 election, there was a lot of hand-wringing in the media about not understanding essentially Trump country, supporters who turned out in droves for him, and therefore meant a lot of missed calls as to that election result. But of course, just being from those areas doesn't necessarily guarantee any kind of ideological diversity. So are you essentially saying that you need to have more conservative reporters, actual reporters who are Trump supporters then?
No, it's a good question, and the answer is no, because we don't want reporters to be motivated by a specific sort of political agenda or ideological agenda. We don't want any reporters to be, there are opportunities in our opinion section, but if you're coming to us and, applying for a job and it's because, I'm a Trump supporter and I want to write supportive articles about Donald Trump in your newspaper, that wouldn't be a high qualification. Frankly, it would be true if you said it about Biden too, but if you say it or you think it or you're that motivated that way, you're not quite the right fit. But I do think that religious, cultural, educational diversity are decent proxies for, there was an interesting, I just caught the end of one of the panels here about the gentleman who does the work on climate change and unions and local communities, and he says sometimes when he's going to talk to people, his southern accent comes back because it opens doors and maybe builds trust. The same thing is true for reporters. I want people who speak and sound like they live in the place. You know, we recently had one fellow from this local investigative reporting fellowship from Mississippi, who sounds like she's from Mississippi. You don't have to talk to her about Mississippi politics. It's, you know, whether she's motivated one way or the other by politics isn't relevant. But she can go and knock on doors in her hometown and say, you know, I am so-and-so and I'm here from the New York Times. And I've heard from dozens and dozens of other reporters who we've sent to go to a place like Mississippi, knock on the door and say, I'm here from the New York Times. It really depends how you say those words. What it sounds like to the person who is hearing those words. If it sounds like it's coming from me, you're likely to get the door slammed in your face. If it sounds like it's coming from your neighbor, actually, it immediately is a conversation starter. And what she said is, actually, people are fascinated. The New York Times has you working, like, you're working here and you work for them? What are you doing? I mean, what's going on? Why would the New York Times care about this or about us? And immediately you're in the door and the conversation has started. So finding people who sound like the people they're reporting on is, to me, a door opener. It doesn't matter the politics. What matters is that you've got some trust and credibility with them.
I think I understand the idea of access, and that's great that reporter is able to do that. But let me push back a little bit, though, on the idea that it's not about politics, in that the mandate for many newsrooms to diversify and to have reporters, particularly from backgrounds that have been neglected in the past, is to essentially to have better and often more empathetic coverage of communities that have been overlooked and maligned. If we're now talking about a particular subset of people, I don't want to paint with a totally broad brush here, but let's say it's a portion of a red state that is, say, heavily motivated by a stream of white nationalism, which we are seeing happen in this country. What does this mean about having somebody who sounds like them and having, in what we would have said about other communities, more empathetic, more understanding coverage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a valid question, but to cover white nationalism, we're not going to go and hire people who say they're white nationalists. I mean, it's obviously, you know, to cover inner city crime, we wouldn't have people who say they commit criminal activities, right? I mean, it's sort of, there are obvious limits to it. I do think that you can find decent diversity proxies to what you're talking about. Is people who have grown up in those communities, who have relatives in those communities, who still live in those communities, who can explain, who can empathize, and who, you know, like doing the kind of journalism that brings the issues, the emotions connected with those events alive in journalism. I think that's a different skill set from saying you believe what they believe. I think good journalists are about understanding how other people believe, to being able to inhabit that space, but not necessarily subjectively having to agree with everything a person says. But I do think that being, you know, there are some limits to that for me as a white Bostonian. I can practice empathy, but I'm not going to be as good as that as somebody who has, you know, some kind of cultural, religious, you know, in some cases military is another bonding experience. If you're a veteran, that can open doors. Some common ground. Actually, we have an opinion columnist who's maybe many of you read him, David French, who comes from a military background. He also comes from an evangelical Christian background, and he still lives in Tennessee, and he has a local community and local friends there, and he talks about what it takes to bond with people. His profession is not a bonding experience. But many other things are, including, he's a fan of the Grizzlies. He's a lawyer who practiced in the military. All of those things can open doors, and they can create a connection with people. You need to find that. If we're gonna figure out what is gonna happen in the 2024 election, not fall into the trap that some of us fell into in the run-up to the 2016 election, that everybody was surprised by the way people voted. We need more people like David French who can find that common ground and get those doors open.
In other forums, I know you've talked about the New York Times' emphasis, certainly in the last election cycle, of being on the side of democracy and defending the democratic values and institutions that actually make a democracy function, whether that's calling out election denialism, etc. Now, for certainly Trump supporters, say, other conservatives who feel that any stories along this line are direct attacks on them, right, on their candidate, on their beliefs. Is the New York Times trying to at least create some kind of shared space or shared reality that where you could actually bring these kinds of readers to you, or because of the values you want to uphold, which seem to be opposed to what they might be espousing, you need to just sort of give up on this community as readers, potential readers of the New York Times?
So on the democracy question, or the health of American democracy, we do, I feel, need to have a kind of, in this case, I will say, a partisan commitment to fully defending the integrity of the electoral system. And I would separate that from politics coverage, because I do think that there is and needs to be common ground among people who might decide at the end of the day, for whatever set of reasons, that they're going to vote for Donald Trump for president. But I do believe that many of those people at the end want to be able to vote for someone else after that. That they're committed to, that they're still committed to the basic institutions of democracy. They want their local electoral system to work properly. They want their vote to count. You hear a lot of rhetoric on both sides of that question, but I do think that we can separate the health of the electoral system and the survival of American democracy from the political process. As difficult as it is, we need to continue to try to do that. We did a bunch of it in the run-up to the 2022 midterms, and we had a separate team of people who were focused on sort of the threat to democratic integrity or electoral integrity that was distinct from the team of people who were covering those running for Congress, right, in the 2022 midterms. I think it was helpful, and it's something we're studying as we look at 2024. But I think we need an investment in that. It means, the integrity of local election boards, the viability, the programs in local state legislatures to potentially empower legislatures to overturn the vote. That's a legitimate subject for us to investigate, and regardless of the politics of it, it might be politically popular. For us, if it's a threat to democracy, we'll go after it directly. I mean, I think at the end of the day, the New York Times doesn't exist in a non-democratic society. The LA Times doesn't exist in a non-democratic society. It's not something that we're agnostic about. We need to remain impartial as to the identity of the person who gets elected president of the United States. We will not remain impartial as to whether or not the democratic system itself will select that person's successor. So I think that's there's never been a more all-in effort for the journalists in America to expose real threats to democracy, but to continue to try to distinguish that as best we can from people's political choices at the end of the day.
Which is getting more difficult since it is so blurred now.
It is blurred, but it's our job to disentangle it.
Yeah. And because a lot of that does revolve around, say, an adherence to shared facts and all that, that's sort of, and shared truths, that lets me maybe transition to another topic, which is going off of the truism that truth is the first casualty of war. You are in the unenviable position of being executive editor at a time when you are devoting major resources to covering not one, but 2 wars now of great consequence. Does this keep you up at night?
Yeah, that keeps me up at night. You know, the Gaza war obviously is still in the early phases, and war, whenever it's developing and when you're in the earliest phases, is the most concerning and time-consuming thing that we can cover, largely because of risk, the risk of people being deployed, you know, to cover conflict in those periods. As a war, you know, as it has now in Ukraine, actually settles into a little bit more of a pattern, and our security people can, you know, work closely with the correspondents and make calculated choices about approaching the front line. And there's still a risk level. The risk level remains high, but it's much, much higher in the early phases when the front line is unknown, you know, when people are rushing to the scene of what's sort of capturing everybody's imagination is the biggest news story. So that, for sure, keeps me up at night. But there's a couple of other aspects of both Ukraine and Gaza that are massive conflict stories for us, that unlike those that I was the most familiar with as really as an editor, because I was not a conflict reporter, but as an editor, they were conflicts in which the United States was directly a combatant, right? They were conflicts in Iraq, conflicts in Afghanistan, you know, more limited engagements in Syria. And those were under the auspices of the very sort of sophisticated, you know, umbrella of the Pentagon, you know, which essentially provides for coverage of a conflict that American troops are involved in. We cover them critically, but we also operate under, you know, kind of the embed, the protective umbrella of the US military. And so we can make calculated risks together with, you know, American professionals who are there on the front lines as well. Neither of these conflicts has that element. You know, Ukraine in particular is a massive European land war that's underway. America is obviously a critical supporter of Ukraine militarily, but there are no American advisors on the ground. We embed with Ukrainian troops, or we approach, you know, the front lines on our own. That's a completely different risk calculus for us, and really required a huge adjustment, and actually a sizable increase in our security, you know, security apparatus on the ground. We at one point had 40 people on the ground in Ukraine, and in the early stages of the war, and the security people sort of raised an alarm and said, we cannot keep these people safe. You need to reduce the number of people you have there. And we did, but it was, you know, there was sort of that maximum strain. Gaza is, you know, a very different story. Gaza is too dangerous to send any international we would not send an international correspondent into Gaza at all at the moment. So we are entirely reliant on Gazan-based Palestinian journalists who want to do work for international news organizations, and there are not a large number of them that are exposing themselves to tremendous risk every day. I mean, they are, you know, taking photographs, doing video, filing dispatches, even as they try to remove their families or keep them safe. We have one photographer who stopped doing work for a day because he had 3 funerals of colleagues to attend. The level of risk is just sort of like nothing I've seen in terms of the journalists actually situated in Gaza itself. And then on the Israeli side, in the early stages after October 7th with that Hamas attack, you had a feeling of fear among Israel correspondents and the Israeli population as a whole that they hadn't really experienced in at least 50 years. The sense that their vaunted military couldn't quite protect them, that they had relatives who were, at the kibbutzim that were attacked. There was the level of fear on both sides of this conflict is beyond anything that I've experienced, at least as an editor.
Also, and the conflict, we have all the political passions around.
Yeah, I noticed that.
The Mideast war, which you will notice on this campus as well, of course, as you walk along and in wider society. Since you have noticed it, and I think in your own newsroom, if you could tell us a bit about what you're having to deal with as the leader of the newsroom, and how you're coping with the very passionate the emotions that are coming into play around this conflict.
Yeah, this is not true of the Ukraine conflict. There are we do have Russian staff who work for the New York Times, but you don't have the same level of sort of connections or divided connections that you have in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. I mean, there are a large number of people, I would say, who feel a natural, sometimes it's journalistic and sometimes it's personal, empathy with the Palestinian cause. I mean, it's just a big part of, especially kind of a larger international, younger generation of correspondents in a way that hasn't been tested before for many of them because we haven't had a conflict on this scale. But that exists. And then parallel to that, you also have, people, who have relatives in Israel who are of, Jewish heritage and feel very, very strongly that, Israel itself faces a massive threat to its existence. And I haven't really seen another conflict that has or elicits that kind of passionate feeling among so many on the staff. It's really strong. We hear it every day. You hear it from multiple sides. It also exists among our readership. I mean, we were just talking a little bit about, we live in a polarized, society in the United States of America, but really that kind of core Trump base of support is not writing the emails, right? They're not complaining about coverage. Like, you've done it again, you said something, you said Trump lies, or something. I don't get those complaints. I get complaints from others who feel we're not critical enough of Trump, but I don't get complaints from Trump supporters. That is not true on this issue. There is such passionate kind of reaction to every aspect of coverage from multiple sides, and it's all unfolding at once. It's unfolding on our staff, it's unfolding among our readers, and it's a challenge to navigate. There's no other way to talk about it. What I would say is that despite those passions and despite those strong feelings, the people involved in coverage have continued to do really outstanding journalism, and I actually think that journalism itself, good journalism, can be a cure for that kind of emotion, right? It's sort of, people have strong views, but you're going to have to translate that into something that relates and produces good journalism out of it. And good journalism is not opinion writing. Good journalism is reporting. You've got an instinct that we're missing something. You've got an instinct that we've been unfair. Go report it out. Go find a story that will help tell that. We'll look at the story. If it's a good one, we'll give it promotion. And we'll do it for everybody involved. If you're feeling that we're missing something fundamentally about what's happening in Israel or about how Israelis feel about this, go find a story. Don't argue and slack. Go find a story, right? And the same is true on the other side. So how many of you use Slack? It's like, Slack is our internal Twitter, basically, and we all know what happened to Twitter, And it is a tool for communication, for real-time communication. It can be very valuable, but I don't want people sitting around all day on Slack any more than I wanted people sitting around all day on Twitter.
I'm glad that you brought it down to the coverage level, in that I had been in the Middle East myself years ago during the Second Intifada, and at that time we had a kind of a jokey rule of thumb that you knew you were doing something right if you were criticized equally from both sides. But that actually pointed up then this debate about the whole both sidesism of conflicts that we cover.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing this playing out here. So at the coverage level, what do you have you approached this conflict any differently from the previous Israel-Hamas war and the Palestinian conflict in general?
I think it is, as I was talking about with respect to Gaza, I think it's even harder to get good journalism out of Gaza now than it would have been in previous Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. The ability to function inside of Gaza, to get correspondence. I mean, in the Intifada, Jerusalem-based correspondents were traveling all the time in the West Bank. They had access to the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. I'm not saying there was no risk involved. It's just not comparable now. So actually getting good, reliable journalism out of Gaza is an enormous challenge. Whereas we have, a very robust team of correspondents that are based in Israel. So the trick is to make sure that we are continuously focused on trying to reflect what's happening in Gaza without anything approaching the kind of access that we've had in the past, or that we could even get in Ukraine. I mean, we did have to reduce our staff in Russia, but we are sending correspondents back in. And trying to reflect the Russian side of this conflict. But, the threat in Russia is for a capricious, police force that may pick up a journalist and create some trumped up charges, as they did with Evan Gershkovich. The trick in Gaza would be that you might not survive on the trip, so it's a different level of risk. And I'd like to say, we don't do both sides journalism. I feel like we can't really do enough good journalism to capture what's happening in Gaza at the moment. But I also think there are some incredibly compelling stories about the way Israel and Israelis are processing this conflict. And it is a totally novel dilemma on the Israeli side as well. So, not sure if that's a full answer to your question, but actually in this case I would aspire to do good both sides journalism in the Israeli-Gaza conflict. We are not a partisan in that fight, and there are important stories to tell on both sides of that conflict, and we have to be committed to doing that.
And I'd love to take this down to the total story level of both conflicts, actually. One with the Israeli-Hamas war and what happened with the hospital explosion of just a couple of weeks ago, and then to the Ukraine war and the missile strike that hit the market in, and I'm going to mangle the pronunciation of this town's name, Kostyantynivka, in September 6th, that killed about 15 people. And with the both of those stories, as initially reported by the Times and by other news organizations, have them as the result of an Israeli airstrike and as the result of a Russian missile strike, respectively. But then now we've, of course, discovered that there have been intelligence reports and other analyses that suggest the hospital explosion in Gaza was because of a Palestinian missile rocket that went astray, and through your own reporters on the ground in Ukraine who analyzed evidence and came to the conclusion that most likely the missile strike that hit the market in that town was actually a Ukrainian missile that went wrong. So there are similar kinds of stories just in terms of what happened on the ground, but let's take the Gaza hospital explosion first. Sort of what happened there in terms of your reporting, and then now you've issued an editor's note, kind of in a sense correcting the record, and where did the pressure come from to change the story? Was it internal? Was it external? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, the pressure was from both, obviously. I mean, it wouldn't be accurate to I already said my inbox has never been fuller, essentially. So there were a lot of people who were upset about that coverage. There were a lot of people internally who were also upset by some of the decision-making going on. And, you know, it was I and my colleagues in the leadership ultimately decided that we actually did feel like we had something that we needed to do to set the record straight. I mean, as I discussed, it was really just a couple of hours, and you know, the breaking news element was pretty quickly updated as new information came in. And the easiest thing to do, in my view, in those moments, is just to say that in every given moment, based on what we knew, we were accurate, right? So it was we had an accurate headline and an accurate attribution to Palestinian officials. Palestinian officials said in the very earliest moments of that hospital blast that an Israeli missile strike had killed hundreds of people. And we attributed the headline. So we, you know, in a narrow sense, had nothing to correct. And when Israel, and actually we held the story, we didn't publish, we were not the first outlet to publish that. Everybody was covering it, but we were a little bit slow because we held back to wait for comment from the IDF. Initially, they didn't make a comment, and then we kept pressing, and they said, the only thing they would say is, we won't talk about where we target our strikes, but we're looking into it. So it sounded to people early on like Israel was kind of not denying it, and the Palestinians were claiming it. And you put those two things together, and in a normal course of covering a big story like that, the headline that we had would be fine. The problem was when I kind of looked back at the decision making, and I was just kind of saying bad things about Slack, but I actually went back into Slack and looked. There were a couple different channels where there was a pretty vigorous and robust debate about the early stages of the coverage, how to frame the top of the story, the headline, the alert that went out with it. And I actually found that all of the information we would have needed to write a better headline in that moment was available at the time. And there were people who were expressing concerns that our headline went too far, that we weren't able to verify quite enough of it, that there wasn't any particular reason that Palestinian official, the Gaza Health Ministry, would know for sure that it was an Israeli strike. Basically, everything that we could have known later was actually being expressed by some people involved in the discussion at the time, but that's not the way the headline ended up. So it felt to me like it wasn't exactly a correction, but it was something that we needed to go back and look at. How did we have the available cautions, the right debate, but end up with the wrong headline? And I think that, you know, needs to be an additional set of guardrails, and probably especially for the very biggest stories. We're not talking about every breaking news story because those get just updated and headlines evolve all the time. The very biggest banner headlines at the top of the website, we need just that additional level of sort of caution, and I would say, you know, default to the most conservative position we can take in those moments, because we're already blaring the trumpets as loud as we possibly can with those giant headlines. We don't need to push the limit of what we say in those moments. We should default to what we can support as much as possible based on independent reporting or multiple sources. And so I thought we needed a reset on that. My colleagues agreed. Not everybody in media did agree, because lots and lots of people had very similar coverage. Very few decided that they wanted to say anything publicly about it, and I understand, because I think you can say we didn't do anything inaccurate. You know, we quoted the official accurately, and we evolved our coverage over time. That's all true. I still think it needed to be something that prompted some deeper reflection.
And I think for particularly the New York Times and its positioning as a global news organization, the multiplier effect of a banner headline. You, as the executive editor and the institution, essentially have a megaphone strapped to your mouths all the time. What you say goes out to a much wider audience at a much greater volume than other news organizations. And so that level of responsibility, I must feel quite heavy, and therefore in a situation
Yeah,
like
I
this.
tend not to, and a lot of people cite causality as you had this headline, therefore this thing happened, on the streets of Cairo, kind of thing, and I tend to not really credit that very, the role of the New York Times is important, and obviously people do look to it. I do think there is a function of the New York Times in big news moments like that people will see things on a variety of media sources, or they'll see it, on X, or they'll see it in their Facebook feed or something, and they won't know if it's true, and then maybe come to the New York Times website and say, what do they have? What do they have in that moment? There is that kind of like double checking thing, and if we have it, then there's an additional confirmation that this really is true. I hear people, having that behavior all the time. They may not be deep readers, but they use us just to see if something is true. So I do think there's an additional responsibility to that. But I think our commitment is not to prevent, what people talk about as being a weaponization of coverage. That's going to go on no matter what. Our commitment is to, ourselves and our readers to have the best possible coverage in every moment, and we have to get out of the old digital newspaper mode of thinking that the web is a rough draft for the paper. The web is not a rough draft for the paper. We have orders of magnitudes more readers who are using that behavior that I talked about, coming to us, checking on us digitally, reading us digitally. We have 10x the number of digital subscribers that we do print subscribers. The day where you just evolved digital stories, and then at the end of the day, you made them as good as they could be, and they went into print at that point, those are over. Print doesn't play that role anymore, and you can't think of the evolution of a story like that. It has to be as good as it can possibly be to have the full value of the judgment of the editors of the New York Times, even in the real-time sense, even in those first iterations.
Then, any of the backstory of that, what the impetus of why the reporters decided to revisit that particular mistake?
Yeah, that one was very different in one sense, in that nobody was questioning it, right? There was a missile strike on a market, and there was a large number of dead. So not the scale of Gaza, but large by an individual strike in Ukraine standards, and it got a lot of publicity, including in the Times. Not that kind of banner headline publicity, but we did have good real-time coverage of it. Zelensky himself, the Ukraine president, came out and said it was a Russian missile strike, and we quoted him as saying that. No one in the moment seemed to doubt that, and none of the coverage doubted it. And by the way, if Russia denied it, it wasn't very prominent, and Russia denied all kinds of strikes that they actually did, so it wouldn't necessarily have been given that much prominence, but in my recollection, they did not prominently deny that. And what happened was, some weeks later, our visual investigations team was taking a look at that strike and trying to recreate it, because it was a large one-time event, and they had done a lot of work on Russian atrocities in a town called Bucha, and they actually thought this might be another one where a market itself was targeted, and that it was worth investigating more deeply. Their work came to show that it couldn't have been a Russian strike, that the direction of travel, that the launch site of a Ukrainian missile that was close in time, and the trajectory and the way that it hit the market aligned solely with a faulty Ukrainian missile. So we did publish that, and there was some acknowledgement on Ukraine's part that it happened. Interestingly, there was, my inbox wasn't full. I mean, I did not get a bunch of people saying, pro-Russian people saying, like, we told you so, these strikes are fake, you messed up. It was, and we got some recognition for having done, kind of independent journalism in Ukraine, which I'm proud of. But it wasn't that kind of emotive reader event that it was in Gaza.
Let me turn to AI now, which is on many of our minds as journalists, and what the New York Times is doing with and about AI. How many people do you have, in a sense, working on that issue, and in what ways are you, maybe the most prominent ways perhaps, that you're using AI now?
Yeah, we have a relatively, large, kind of team that involves many people from across the company as well as the newsroom, studying the implications of the AI for all kinds of different things. And I sit in on some of those meetings, and I would say there's, kind of 8 or 9 different areas where AI, is going to kind of, or is being studied as potentially transformational. But 7 or 8 of those are outside of the newsroom. There are just all kinds of things like AI is going to allow us to take the next step in sort of sophisticated, kind of what we call the funnel, right? The reader's experience as they navigate the New York Times and are exposed or not exposed to the paywall, and the kind of interactions you have with them, and how you can make a paywall more flexible. Those kinds of things are going like at very rapid pace, and I would say AI is already being employed in the early stages in kind of those various business functions. So we're not that atypical from any company that's out there that is trying to figure out the way that this could enhance, operations in all kinds of areas. On the journalistic side of things, we're being more cautious. We're being a lot more cautious, and there is not any journalism which goes directly to readers or viewers of the New York Times that doesn't pass through human hands. And I think it's unlikely that will happen, at least in the time that I'm the editor, that we would actually employ AI in producing completely a piece of journalism which we then publish without human intervention. But there are some areas where I think it can be a tool upstream of that, sometimes way upstream of that. The original information gathering process. There was one interesting experiment that's underway for people who cover a geographic region, using AI tools to basically take recordings from like school board meetings or city council meetings in a sprawling area that you cover, and then you take those audio transcripts and search for keywords, that might align with themes that you're covering. That would be something that it would take a human, umpteen hours to listen to multiple transcripts, but actually an AI tool could begin to produce clues about where to look. Now, the human being would have to go back at that information later. There's nothing publishable in that. It's a research tool that's upstream of actually doing the reporting in that case, much less the writing. But we're experimenting with scenarios like that. We're also experimenting with how it can we do some translation work. We actually used to do more, but we actually had a big team doing Spanish language translations. We 5 or 6 years ago, we scaled that back because our ability to translate enough to get a dedicated audience in Spanish just wasn't economical. So we still did some for sort of mission reasons because we want to reach an audience. But we're looking at potentially scaling that back up again with the use of AI, if it can really speed up. And actually what AI might be able to do in terms of translation is not so much you give it a piece of text and say, translate this into whatever language, but actually AI can figure out what human translators do to make that read like New York Times journalism. So the translation actually you could already do with Google Translate. The problem was it would produce rather bad experience in whatever language you were producing it into, and we had human translators who had to basically rewrite it and make it idiomatic and understand New York Times style book and standards and actually create a piece of journalism that we could be proud of in the other language. The AI tools can actually monitor, some of those best translators and potentially begin to scale some of the work that they do to render translations into actual usable form in another language. So there's some exciting things along those lines.
There's also a lot of concern, though, within the journalism industry, media industry, about the scraping of data, the harvesting of data from sources like the New York Times or in other news organizations to feed these systems and to try to make sure that either you're getting compensated or that they're not doing that illegally. I did see that it was reported in June that you were at a gathering in which you speculated that publishers might band together and be able to stand their ground against this kind of activity and a fight back. But then a couple of months later, it was reported that the Times has pulled out of a group effort that was being spearheaded by Barry Diller to do just this thing. Isn't there greater force in numbers? Why pull out from an effort like that when we're all being faced with what could be, I don't want to say existential, but something with very real implications for our jobs and for our industry?
Yeah, I will say that on that one, first of all, there was a session where it was a media conference. Literally, the media conference is called Off the Record. That's what the conference is called. And then people reported on what happened. It was a little bit of a distortion. I didn't really say that publishers should band together. I said that every publisher is facing the same issue right now, which is that these AI tools are like vacuum cleaners, and obviously publishers are all trying to figure it out, and they're talking about what solutions we. There was no, there's a legal issue related to publishers actually working together on something like that, and I wasn't speaking to that. And in fact, I'm not speaking to it, really at all. It is something that is being dealt with literally by our legal department. That there are active discussions as we've talked about with the companies that are developing the leading AI tools and the terms under which the New York Times would or wouldn't participate in those things. And it is essentially now a legal issue. It's not a journalistic issue. The journalistic issue is we're covering the uses of AI. We're covering the development of those tools. But the actual use of New York Times content by, Bard or ChatGPT or OpenAI is something that's being handled by lawyers, essentially.
I want to get back to the digital transformation of the New York Times, and I love this, that in 1986, so we're talking nearly 40 years ago, when you were president of the Crimson, you gave an interview to C-SPAN in which you said, "I hope to try my hand at journalism, print journalism, for some time." Well, now here we are nearly 40 years later. Do you still refer to the New York Times, first of all, as the paper, as the newspaper? And do you actually foresee the day, maybe even under your watch, where there is no longer a print version of the New York Times?
I don't refer to it as the paper. People still do, but I don't. One of the things that I have been working on even during the time that I was the managing editor, but continuing into this time, is to move. The print operation has become, separate from the journalistic workflow every day. So it used to be, if you think back to the earliest days of the web, the New York Times was first published on the web in 1996. And then it started to seem interesting, and we put a lot of people working on web journalism, and at some point they were in a different building, and there was even a point where I think like the web operation of the New York Times was like lined up to do its own IPO as a separate media company that would use New York Times journalism and separately listed. It took, a long time, 25 plus years, but that's been flipped on its head. I mean, basically the print operation is now a downstream operation that is very competently, but also separately run by a team of, editors and page designers and photojournalists who put together out of everything that we publish, not necessarily that day. A lot of print. The print publication times is now pretty separate, especially for something that might have a longer lasting quality. If we do a big piece of enterprise digitally, and they can give it a big display, or they can even do a special section, 4 or 5 days later in print, they have the license to do that. We've taken the debate over page one stories out of the daily news meetings, so that's also decided separately. So I don't think that we refer to the paper. We've stopped allowing people to literally pitch page one stories. You can send a note to the editor of the print hub and say, I hope you're considering this, but we don't entertain page one pitches in our news meetings anymore. The reason is things like the Gaza headline. I want people's focus on what we're doing to make sure we have our very best journalism at the moment that the maximum number of people are encountering that journalism. And you can't do that if you're still thinking about what's going to appear in print the next day. Print will take care of itself, it does. With this in the hands of this very good team, it doesn't need our journalists thinking about print for most of the day. I do think that there is still it's declining, but it's not declining quickly, a robust print audience that really likes the print experience, that wants to get, a really nicely curated digest of the New York Times of the day delivered to their doorstep. And print readers are spending an hour on average, according to our surveys, with the print product every day. That's a lot of time. Even if you're Netflix, that's a significant amount of time, right? People are spending an hour a day, 730 or whatever the number is, 730,000 people are getting it and spending an hour a day. So we are not going to, we will not disappoint that audience as long as they want that product, we're going to provide it to them. But I don't want to have a newsroom of 1,750, 800 people. 100 of them are working on print. The others should not be thinking that they're working specifically on print.
So the figure that is put out is that the New York Times now has nearly 10 million digital subscribers. That was in the latest quarterly report, and nearly all of them, or most of them, are digital only. But more than a quarter of that, if you look under the hood a little bit, those are subscriptions only to either those news adjacent things like cooking, or games, or Wirecutter, or now The Athletic. And then if you look at last year, the second quarter, and you compare it to this quarter, people who have subscribed to the New York Times and have news as part of that, that's definitely gone up. The figure is now 400,000 from last year, second quarter, to this year, second quarter. But how confident are you that it's actually the journalism that is driving those subscriptions and not those who are interested in the news adjacent items, and now the journalism is actually becoming value added?
I'm confident that that isn't the case. I'm confident that news, all the aspects of news journalism is absolutely integral and essential to the identity of the New York Times. The vast majority of people who are in our ecosystem and are coming into our ecosystem for the first time are coming to that experience because of news journalism. Even with the very healthy development of these satellite products, which I think are synonymous with the brand. I mean, they are intelligent, well-developed, human curated games and cooking. Wirecutter is a large and actually very talented newsroom of journalists who do reviews, and then recently the New York Times purchased The Athletic, which is a very large newsroom of 500 sports journalists. So these other products, including games came out of the New York Times newsroom are all journalistic products. And so I am very happy that some percentage of people are coming for those experiences primarily, but it's a small minority, and the first of all, the identity of the company, even if that were not the case, we would still be investing. We think of news as the sun, and those other products as sort of the planets or the moons. Even if that were not the case, we would still be enhancing the core identity, but helpfully it is the case. The overwhelming appeal of the New York Times to a new and growing audience is the news journalism. It's what brings people in. Those other products are what help create an experience that helps them keep coming back every day. But there are relatively few and actually declining number of people who are only subscribing to one of those subsidiary products. And so I'm very confident that the news and the newsroom and news itself will remain the core of the New York Times indefinitely into the future.
We only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to ask you just some very quick fire questions. No need for great elaboration. Do you have any intention of restoring the position of an ombudsperson or a public editor?
There's an ongoing kind of discussion and debate about that issue, but I don't think there is a consensus or a plan right now to do that. It's not something that I feel we absolutely should never do. But there were a bunch of issues with the public editor or the individual public editors that we had over the years, and the structure of that our publishers and all of them actually worked for the publisher and not for the editor. And our publisher made that choice that it wasn't working out quite as he saw fit at that time, and there's no plan on the way now to change it.
Foreign story today from an American point of view, obviously not about the U.S. itself.
Well, it won't surprise you that I still have an ongoing commitment to try to understand the China story the rapid and concerning change in U.S.-China or China's relations with much of the outside world, as well as the difficulty of when I was there, we were in the phases of actually building up our China team. At one point, we had 10 or 11 foreign correspondents in China. That most of those people were told to leave, and we're now down to 2. So we have the second largest economy in the world, the second largest military power in the world, and we only have 2 correspondents there. So China's on my mind for a variety of reasons, journalistic reasons, but also kind of logistics and deployment and trying to get more people back in.
Who's your journalism hero?
Who's my journalism hero? Walter Lippmann. In fact, I recommend that we just dedicate some building at Harvard and just gather good journalists together regularly and meet in that place.
And very last, Wordle or spelling bee?
I'm a spelling bee.
Joe Kahn, yeah. Thank you very much for spending this hour with us.